Lee, thank you for joining us today. I know you know a lot of history of the Bar Association and lawyers and projects the Bar Association has done, so we're looking forward to you sharing with us what you can remember and share with us so we can keep it in our oral history project. Let's start out, when you first started practicing law, where did you put up your shingle?
Well, 22 South 3rd, but I'd like to go a little before that because I have some interesting history I think would lead up to my becoming a lawyer. When I went to Dickinson School of Law, of course, when I'm in my first year at Dickinson, we had 86 students and 3 were women.
Wow.
Which I think things have changed a little bit since then.
Do you remember who they were, the women, and what?
No, but the second year, my second year, there was a woman by the name of Sylvia Rambo.
Judge Rambo.
And I can't remember the names of the 3 ladies, but when we looked at the bar results after our first year, we of course didn't take the bar, but we wanted to see how our predecessors had done. And there was only a 46% passage.
Wow.
And then the second year, there were, of the 80-some students, only maybe 50-some came back.
Did they say, look to your left and look to your right, and one of you will not be here next year?
I think somebody did say that.
Because historically, that's what the law professors would do with the dean to try to shake you up a little bit.
Yeah, and of course in those days you had that honors essay exam for the bar exam, you know, no multiple choice, and I think that was more difficult than later on to pass the bar.
So when you graduated, how many women were in your class?
2. That's it.
And how about minorities as far as race goes? Anybody in your class?
We had no minorities. I don't believe, I can't remember any in my 3 years.
But that has changed today,
oh, yes,
too,
of course.
luckily. So after you graduated from law school, well, why did you go to law school?
Well, my sister was married to a lawyer whose office is on Fifth Avenue in New York, and he kept encouraging me, even though I hadn't planned to do this. And finally I said, okay, I give up, and I applied.
Did you go to New York City a lot
Oh,
as
yeah.
a kid?
Well, I started going to New York City when I was like 18 years old. I'm a big jazz fan, and I used to go out and hang out in the jazz clubs, because in those days you could drink at the age of 18 in New York City. And so that's where I got started. And then my sister moved to New York, and she married a New York lawyer, and so then I kept going more and more.
And what type of jazz players did you get to meet and become friendly with?
Oh, all the great players, I guess. Well, one of our favorite players was Dexter Gordon, who made the greatest jazz music called Round Midnight, the movie. And I also helped to found the Central Pennsylvania Friends of Jazz, 3 of us, and we had all these great players come for years and years and years up here, including Dexter, who we hung out with at a friend of mine's big mansion up in North Front Street, Jack Snavely. And but I saw Bill Evans. I mean, it would just be
Gillespie?
In fact, I got to know Dizzy Gillespie when my wife was living in New York before we got married, and we used to hang out with Dizzy Gillespie at the various clubs. He liked her. Yeah, Thelonious Monk, whom you may never have heard of, who was a fantastic and unorthodox piano player. Bud Powell, Bill Evans, I mean, all the great players.
Well, I know that you have a great affection for jazz and appreciation for it, and just had some great weekends up there in New York City. As a young kid, you would go all by yourself, right?
Yep. Well, yeah, as I was looking out the window here, you can see the river boat on the other side of the river. Well, I have a jazz program every Thursday nights in the summer.
On the Susquehanna
On the
Riverboat.
Susquehanna Riverboat.
So,
Tonight.
so your love continues of the jazz,
Yep, I'll be
right?
there tonight.
Okay. So after you graduated from law school, did you have to serve what they used to call a preceptorship?
Yes, but I did that sort of before law school because in those days, in my second year, I got a clerkship with Judge Walter Sohn, and that, as I recall, took care of at least half my preceptorship. I was with him several summers, and I can talk a little bit about the judges in those days when we get to that point, but he was very nice to me, and that helped.
Well, great. And then after law school, where did you start practicing?
I started practicing with a lawyer by the name of Joe Hepford, H. Joseph Hepford, at 22 South 3rd Street, and Roy Zimmerman, who later became the Attorney General much later. He was with us, and Walter Compton, who was in those days the referee in bankruptcy, and a couple other lawyers. Nolan Ziegler, who was the mayor of Harrisburg and also a lawyer. Didn't practice much, but he was a lawyer. Nolan Ziegler, great guy.
Didn't you grow up with Roy Zimmerman?
Well,
Harold Zimmerman?
yeah, when I was like 2 and Roy would have been 4, we lived across from each other on Market Street at the corner of Chestnut. Roy was on the riverside of it. They had what they called the Peanut House, which was a small restaurant and a beautiful peanut roaster, and he lived upstairs with his uncle and aunt and his mother. So, and I lived in an apartment house, which is now the Holiday Inn or whatever it is there, which
Crown
is
Plaza?
Crown Plaza, yeah. That was called the Acre Apartments.
So you started practicing, and then that law firm was in existence for quite a while. Was it Hepford,
Swartz and Hepford, Zimmerman, and Swartz, and then when Roy became the AG, it was Hepford, Swartz, and Morgan.
And you had one of the very first women lawyers in that firm.
Well, yeah, I believe when I started practicing, there were 3, and I think by the time we started our firm in around 1960, sometime around 1965, Bonnie Menaker came there, and she was probably only the 4th or 5th lawyer at that time.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there were very few women lawyers in private practice
It's true.
For decades.
Right.
But that's changing a little bit today. So did you begin your practice as a general practitioner? No one specialized in those days like they do today, isn't that right?
That is true. And yes, I was a general practitioner, and I did everything from criminal law, family law, personal injury. I could say in those days there was no public defender, so the bar got together and they hired 2 lawyers at $300 a month to represent these people. Harry Goldberg and I were the first 2. They called them voluntary defenders, I think, in those days. We got $300 a month.
Wow, wow. Although $300 in those days was real money, huh?
Well, and there was a lot more crazy criminal cases. I mean, like fornication and bastardy. I mean, come on.
Well, who was on the bench then?
Well, you had the president judge was Carl Richards. He had been a district attorney in the 30s, and he was the orphans court judge. In those days, you ran for orphans court. I mean, it was a separate court, and he must have been the orphans court judge for 20-some, maybe 30 years. I don't know. And then there was Walter Sohn and Carl Shelley, who was from Steelton, and Homer Kreider. That might have been it.
Probably was.
Yeah, I think that was it.
And all the judges handled everything general jurisdiction other than the orphans court.
That's
judge.
true. They handle everything, and they had in those days there were a lot of gay persons cases. You know, that was a crime, and if they caught you, you went to jail for it. And maybe 10 years after I started to practice, there was a raid up on State Street, and they arrested 20-some people, sent them to jail.
Terrible.
I mean, I represented a lot of those, not those people, but others. I did a lot of criminal work. I had 3 murder cases. I had all other kinds of cases, and I always thought it was so silly to be prosecuting these people.
So you became known as a great trial lawyer, a great personal injury lawyer.
Well, the great is in the mind of the beholder, I guess. But but I did. Yes, I was a trial lawyer specialist. I actually was one of the first 60 in the United States that when the American trial lawyers developed the trial lawyer specialty, you had to take an exam and all that. And then I brought that to Pennsylvania, and we became a member of that. But yeah.
So who were some of the nationally renowned trial lawyers that you became friends with?
Well, Melvin Belli and I were very good friends, and there were a lot of others that you probably wouldn't recognize that were nationally known. Bob Cartwright, for one, but Jim Ackerman. But Mel and I got involved in what they called the American trial lawyers in those days, and they met in San Francisco, and I got to know Mel Belli and all the great lawyers out there. And
did you do any special trips with Mel Belli?
yes, we went to Cuba back in the days when you weren't supposed to go to Cuba. We applied for a Treasury clearance, and we got down there, myself and a couple other lawyers, and we had a grand old time with Mel. We were always worried that Mel was going to say something wrong, because Mel talked a lot, and no matter where you went, the big news agencies wanted to interview Mel, Reuters and all that, and we were scared that Mel would say something and then we'd have to stay in Cuba. So they said to Mel, they said, you know, you might not get out of here. And he said, and we had gone to a Cuban trial. There was it's a 5-judge thing, the judge and jury. They all 5 sit there. There's the judges, and then they go out and they deliberate. And it was quite interesting. It was a drunken driving trial, and these judges, they tried the case, and then they went out and they came back, and the sentence, the finding was pretty much what Dauphin County would have given the guy. So when they said to Mel, you know, you might not be able to get out, he said, well, I'll get out, but if I don't, they have a legal system I can work with.
So that was pretty good. That was pretty good.
Yep.
So do you feel like you were followed, or they knew who you were when you were in Cuba?
They knew who we were, and we were given the red carpet treatment. It didn't need to be followed. I mean, I got to know some very important people. The one guy, I think, you know, it was sort of like maybe the equivalent of the head of the CIA or something in Cuba. And we hung out together, and he took me down late at night, and we walked the city. And
Havana?
Yeah, Havana. And there was, you know, when Castro came over in the boat, that boat was in a park. And I wanted to see that boat, and when I went down there, they wouldn't let me in. So we went down. Then when I went down with this guy, he walked right up and he said, "Move." And they opened the gate, and I came in and I could see the boat.
Wow. So why do you think you got the red carpet treatment?
I don't know exactly why it was me, because it was the rest. They didn't know this fellow, but somehow he hooked up with me. I can't tell you why.
Well, he must have liked you.
There was another interesting thing, too. We took a bus trip out to Castro's older brother, not the guy that eventually became president, but the older brother who was maybe our equivalent of the Secretary of Agriculture. And as I was the first off the bus, and he's there, and he says, "Lee Swartz, you went to Albright College and Dickinson School of Law, and you practiced law in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania."
So they had your bio.
Yeah.
Well, so the CIA was up and running even back then.
Yeah.
That was in the early 60s,
It was in the late 60s.
after the revolution.
Yeah, after the revolution.
So, back to Harrisburg. You started practicing law. Did you become part of the Bar Association, an active part of the Bar
Right
Association
away,
then?
right away, yeah.
And what types of things did the Bar Association do then?
Well,
Special activities?
yeah, I was told, leading up to that, I was told when I became a lawyer by people that were my good friends, older lawyers and so forth, that I should join the Masons because I'd never be successful if I wasn't a Mason. And frankly, there were many lawyers who were Masons. But since I'm sort of an anti-disestablishmentarianist, why, I said, nah, I'm not going to join the Masons. And I think I did all right without that.
I think you did. I think you did. But what activities did you do in the Bar Association? Did you start any programs?
Yeah, I started, there was a lawyer by the name of Irv Benjamin who was with Saul Hurwitz's firm. He was a famous lawyer. And he was the president of the Pennsylvania Bar. And he wanted me to start some kind of a legal CLE course, which we did for years and years in the Dauphin County Courthouse, and we served dinner, and we got all. But by that time, I got to know a lot of the good lawyers in Pennsylvania, and we brought them up to lecture, and we did all of that, which led up to the time when I eventually became involved in the Pennsylvania Bar Institute and their CLE.
And weren't you instrumental in getting CLE mandatory for lawyers in Pennsylvania?
Oh, yeah, I was, yeah. I used to be a member of the House of Delegates of the Pennsylvania Bar. And I kept pushing this. And finally we got it. We had a vote, and it passed. I had a really good friend, close friend, who he didn't think you needed CLE, which he didn't. He was a great lawyer. He probably didn't need it. And he looked at me and he said, "It's all your fault." And I said, "That's the greatest compliment you ever gave me, Morris."
Well, and I think that is true. Then, how about the local bar association? Were you involved in any new programs of our local bar association?
Well, I did get help to start, or actually it was my idea, I guess, the minority law clerk program, where we brought, they were mostly from Dickens, but not all, to come down, and I tried to sell the law firms on paying these kids a weekly salary in the summer. And it was difficult. I mean, I'm going to say that there probably weren't more than a half a dozen firms that would do it. And but then we did recruit, and Clarence Morrison, who's of course the first black judge in Dauphin County, great guy, became the president judge. I got this idea: let's go to Howard and recruit minorities. So he and I went down there.
He went to Howard University.
He was a graduate of Howard University, and we had 15 students come up one summer, and it was a pretty good program. Well, one of my clerks eventually became head of Pfizer.
Wow.
And another clerk, it was Jay Shaw, that Hasu Shaw, who owns all these hotels in New York. He lives around here, you know. He was my clerk, and Jay's now taken over the business for his dad. So
they became successful lawyers.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, you're to be commended for getting that program started. We used to have a separate minority bar association and a separate women's bar association group. So the integration challenges continue even today.
Well, yeah, I think they do. I mean, we still don't have enough of minority lawyers in our bar, and I can't say exactly why that is. I understand we still have the minority program, but I don't have any answers for it.
Right. So tell me about some of your interesting cases that you had and your experiences with some of the Dauphin County judges. And you can use names or not.
Well, I tried 3 murder cases, and in those, that was what, they were separate appointments. That wasn't the public defender type thing. They would, in those days, they would appoint separate lawyers, and
For murder, they would just do it for murder
just for
cases.
murder cases, right? And
What did you get paid? Do you remember?
I think I got $500 maybe. But I can say that I never got a first-degree conviction.
There you go.
I had 1 second degree, as I recall, and 2 voluntary manslaughter.
Well, that's good.
And the one guy went to high school with me. He was and it was a stupid thing. I mean, and it shouldn't even been a conviction, I don't think. And down on 13th Street, he and 2 guys were fighting with knives. I don't know if they intended to cut each other or not, but some poor jerk who was half drunk, I think, came in between, and he got stabbed and was killed. And so that was that case.
Well, that sounds like you got the appropriate verdict in that. So what was the relationship between the bench and the bar? Everyone seems to think the relationship with the bench and bar today is pretty good, but what was it like in the 60s, 70s?
I think it was pretty good then. In those days, I think the bar association had a little more control over the practice. For example, there was no disciplinary board per se. Each county was its own disciplinary board.
Oh, how did that work?
Well, there wasn't much discipline. The only person that I knew of that got disciplined was Jewish.
And do you think it was because of his religion?
I don't want to say that, but
Well,
because
could have been.
it could have been.
Could have been.
It could have been.
But when a lawyer would do something inappropriate, what type of activities would they then have to meet with the board of the
Yeah,
bar
there was a disciplinary, I guess you'd call it a board, committee maybe, of the bar, and it was all secret. I mean, the public couldn't come in and see it or anything. I don't exactly know what went on there because I wasn't a part of it. I knew, I did find out that some people were being interviewed, and they did not get any discipline. The person that I knew of that had discipline, that was before I went into the practice. So.
But what were the common problems that you saw with lawyers? Alcoholism, drug use, stealing money?
Stealing money and alcoholism, I think, were the 2 biggest. Yeah.
Which I think today is probably the top 2 that
Is that
our
right?
board deals with.
Uh-huh.
Right. And the disciplinary board would meet with the lawyers, it's my understanding, but they had no power to issue any sanctions other than just a strong talking to.
No, I think, that's our county disciplinary board. I think they could disbar a lawyer. I don't know whether they had to go past that and get permission from a higher body or not, but I think because this lawyer that I said was disbarred, he was disbarred by our local bar, but whether or not they had to get some kind of acceptance, I'm not sure.
Did you have to be approved to become a member of the Dauphin County Bar as a young lawyer?
I think I had to have a sponsor. As I recall, you had to have a sponsor in those days.
I can remember Judge Morrison saying that he was approved, but then they required that he send a photograph of himself in, and then when they saw that he was an African-American black person, his approval got withdrawn, but a judge on his behalf then had to intervene and get his approval. Do you recall
Yeah,
that?
I know the story. Carl Shelley was Carl Shelley's law clerk. Carl Shelley was Stilton's judicial representative in the
We
day.
still have one today.
And yeah, and Carl, who he's the last person you would have thought of to be what he did for Clarence. I mean, he was certainly to the right of center, but when it came to Clarence Morrison, he did the job.
And so Clarence got
Yeah.
admitted as a lawyer.
Right.
And then it's my understanding when Judge Morrison ran for judge, because of our culture at that time, he was not allowed by the Republican Party to appear in person north of Dauphin because of the racial issues and prejudice that was a little bit more extreme in the upper end.
Well, just
recall that?
say he was encouraged not to go up to the upper end.
Right. And those are the days of Pop Pop Taylor?
Well, yeah. I'm glad you mentioned Taylor, because he was sort of a part of all of this.
Harvey Taylor, which some people called him Pop Pop Taylor.
Yeah,
is that right?
well, they some of them pop up. Yeah, Harv Taylor was president pro tem of the center for 30-some years. You couldn't get elected governor unless you had his nod. He was the primary mover behind Bill Scranton. He was 103 years old when he died.
He picked the judges, didn't he?
He picked, not only did he pick the judges, I always said that if there was the office of dog catcher, you would have had to get Harv Taylor's nod for that, because
He was a political boss.
he was a big political boss. And I was, in those days as a young lawyer, one of his lieutenants asked me to become a ward leader, and I was in the ward of Susquehanna had townships had wards, so I was a ward leader for a number of years there. And I always like to tell a story. People think that we bought votes and all that stuff.
Well, I have heard a few stories.
I would go to Harv Taylor. He had an office in what was then the USF&G building, and he would say, "Lee, how much money do you need?" And I'd say, "Well, $400. He'd give it to me in a paper bag. We'd take it out. What did we do with it? We bought lunches for the judges of elections and the constables. We paid drivers to go out and get people so they could come in to vote. That's where we spent that money." But as I say, you couldn't get elected judge or anything else without Harv Taylor's nod.
Okay. But it's my understanding that he picked Clarence to run at that time because they were interested in having a minority
Yeah,
on the bench.
yeah.
But no women.
No women, and I don't know that there was, I can't remember back in those days any woman ever seeking the judgeship. The four women that I knew, there were three plus Bonnie Menaker. I don't think Bonnie she never wanted to be a judge, and they never wanted to be a judge. So, I mean, it isn't as if they were foreclosed from being judges. Of course, but there weren't enough of women lawyers, and I'm not actually sure why that was. But I did.
Our culture at the time, obviously.
Yeah, I guess.
Right?
Yeah.
So what are some memories that you have of your years as a lawyer in Dauphin County that you want to share with us that we don't want to ever forget about things that you have done or things you observed?
When I started out, the Bar Association was housed in the Lawyers' Lounge in the courthouse, and there was a little room inside where we had a secretary with a desk.
On the fourth floor
On the
of the
fourth
courthouse.
floor of the courthouse. Then there was a building across the street from the courthouse, which is now torn down. We finally moved over there, and that building, we had a little office, and there were lockers where you could put a bottle of whiskey if you wanted to.
I remember having lunch here. It was nice.
It was nice, and Frank Oz loved it. We called it Frank's Folly. And I was treasurer of the bar in those days, and I think for 10 consecutive months, I voted to close the restaurant, and finally it closed.
But it was fun. Well, we thank you for buying this building, because we have a lot of events here, and it's just a beautiful building overlooking the beautiful Susquehanna, so
It is.
thank you for that.
Well,
So were there some other memories that was a success, definitely, and that we thank you for? What are some other events that you remember of either lawyers or bar association events that we wouldn't ever want to forget or not know about?
well, I guess mainly my contributions to the Bar Association were continuing legal education and specialization, and to some extent involved in the disciplinary system. And I did that. I'm sort of proud of the fact that I produced the first family law program in Pennsylvania through the Pennsylvania Bar Institute. So I was very active in CLE.
Well, tell me about your involvement in Pennsylvania Bar Institute. How did that start, and how were you involved with that, and how did that evolve?
Well, the Pennsylvania Bar Institute was started as a nonprofit corporation, an adjunct to the Pennsylvania Bar, and it had a board of directors, and early on I was asked to become a member of the board, and it had a series of great executive, well, I shouldn't say that all great executive directors. It was sort of a funny story. The first 3 executive directors were alcoholics, and one of them ended up running naked in New Orleans. But then they.
What year are we talking about?
Oh,
when
I'm going to. Well, I'm going to say no. It was earlier.
60s.
Yeah, in the early '60s, and then they got the guy, Gilbert Ackroyd, who was a colonel in the legal system of the federal government, and one of the top guys, and brilliant. And not only was Gil brilliant, but he used to write the materials. I mean, this is a guy who was primarily a criminal lawyer, but he wrote materials and everything. I mean, he was just so good. And
You mean for the continuing
yeah,
education program?
yeah.
Was he involved, and were you involved in the development of the jury instruction committees?
Well, that was separate, yeah, but he started out in that a little bit. But yes, I was early on. We formed this committee. Jim Beasley was a great lawyer in Philadelphia. He was the chair, and I was on it for years and years. I was what they called the reporter.
Well, it's the Beasley School of Law now at Temple, so
Yeah.
he was more than a great lawyer. He's
He
a
made a lot of money.
great lawyer.
I think he put $10 million into Temple.
But he used to be very poor and a bus driver.
Yeah,
So he
yeah.
made his way well.
Yeah.
So tell me about the jury instruction committee and how all your work on that.
Well, the jury instructions committee are said to be suggested jury instructions, which we hope all the trial judges will follow. And it's a Supreme Court committee to the extent that the Supreme Court can supervise it if it wants to. Whenever we would add a name, we would send it to the Supreme Court, and it would always be approved. That way I got to know all the Supreme Court justices from the 60s on up to the present time.
And you became chair of that committee, right?
Yeah, after Jim Beasley died, I was the chair for, I don't know, 10 years, maybe more, I can't remember. And I think we really did that might be my biggest contribution to the Bar Association, I think. Because I think they're good instructions. They're followed by all the trial judges. Some trial judges think they have to follow them. We don't tell them any different.
Well, recently, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court gave you an award and a commendation, and at the end of that, all the Supreme Court justices stood up and gave you a standing ovation, which I don't know any other lawyer who's ever received an en banc standing ovation from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and it was quite an event that I certainly will remember
Well,
forever.
I guess it was the highlight of my legal career. I never expected it. I was astounded. I didn't know what to say.
Well, it was wonderful, and I'm glad I could share that moment with you. Is there anything else you would like to share with us so we can retain it in our oral history of the Dauphin County Bar
There were some
Association?
sad things that occurred. I don't know if you
Okay.
may have known of this, but there was a president of our bar association whose name was Louis Kunkel, and you've heard of Congressman John Kunkel.
Yes.
He was a cousin, you must know about this, for maybe you don't. He lived out near where I live on Progress Avenue. He had a nice big estate of maybe 50 or 60 acres. He hunted there, and some poacher came out there and murdered him while he was hunting. You ever
Terrible,
you
terrible.
heard of that, right?
Yes.
That was an awful thing. That was the worst thing that ever happened, I think, to any bar member.
Well, now they've had people shot in the Cumberland County Courthouse.
Oh yeah, that was. Well, you had a program on Judge Bill Caldwell, and his wife's father was shot. There was some disgruntled domestic relations defendant or something.
Her dad was a judge in Cumberland
Yeah, he
County.
was a judge in Cumberland County, and he was shot, and the guy went to jail, I think, for life. And the lawyer, there was a lawyer was killed.
Right.
Killed the lawyer and shot the judge.
Did we ever have anything like that in the Dauphin County Courthouse that you can recall? I'm unaware of any.
No, I don't think we ever had any gun threats. Of course, they collect. It's amazing the number of guns they collect as people try to go in the front door.
Hundreds.
Yeah.
Hundreds a month.
Yeah, it's astounding.
But I don't recall anyone. I know that many have lunged at judges and tried to hurt or kill judges without a gun, but I don't know that there's ever been
I don't think so.
an actual assault like
No.
has happened in many counties.
No, I don't think so.
I know that lawyers have punched other lawyers in proceedings, but other than that, it's been rather calm.
Well, we did have a lawyer who later became a judge who was trying as a defense. He had a defendant in a criminal case. He accused the judge of railroading his client, and we have a nice cell down in the bottom of the courthouse that he ended up in.
Well, I think Judge Kleinfelder got put in this cell down in York County, too.
That I don't remember.
Yep.
But now that I wasn't going to mention any names, but Joe Kleinfelder was a good friend of mine. His father had a stationery store and up
Camera store.
Camera store up on 3rd Street that he ended up running.
Near the Midtown Book Scholar.
Yeah, and then when he decided to become a judge, we helped him sell his practice and everything. So I knew Joe Kleinfelder very well. We never talked about that old situation with Shelley.
Well, I can tell you the other fellow judges, we would remind him of that frequently.
Did you really?
Well, I want to thank you for your time with us today and your memories. And if you think of something else that you want to share with us, we'd love to hear it.
No, I don't. I guess you've covered it pretty well, Judge. As being the first of your type in Dauphin County, and now I understand. How many more ladies do we have? I lost track.
One,
Just one more.
Yeah.
So it'll be more. It'll be more. I've lived to see the participation of women in the legal profession, and it sort of warms my heart to see how many women are lawyers in the way it used to be when, and I don't know why it used to be like that, but
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time.
my pleasure.
Thank you.